Hey, we are really fortunate today to have a CEO and chairman of a great company, and one that is going to illuminate opportunities for us and really help, spur us to thinking about what we can do in working with our CEOs. Let me just open first. I read through all his biographical information. He's an incredibly capable and highly experienced person. But one thing that, and I know his company well, we're partners in a lot of different ways. We sell to each other, we do work together. And then down at the very bottom, it talked about his going to Holy Cross in Worcester, Mass., and I know Worcester, Mass., and that he has a degree that's not that common in chemical industry or chemical-related products. And it made me think of a Broadway play called Avenue Q. And has anybody seen Avenue Q? Yep, okay, about 10% of you. But there's a song in there that says, "What do you do with a BA in English?" That's the song. It's a funny song. Well, let me tell you, Doug Baker knows what to do with a BA in English. And it's built an incredible enterprise that he's going to talk about today. He's been leading a sustainability renaissance at Ecolab over the last decade. They're a B2B company. They're helping their customers improve their eco-efficiency and sustainability in the water area. They're one of the leading water treatment companies in the world. Now in energy with a recent acquisition, and in the food and beverage sector. So B2B. But the way this company works is really more like a company with a heart and focus on B2C, okay? And business to consumers. And Doug spent his first 7 years with Procter & Gamble in brand management. So, we really have this gentleman who will go through today the journey and the excitement of Ecolab. He cut his teeth leading a whole variety of businesses and functions in Ecolab and really earned his stripes on the science side. Ecolab is one of the strongest science companies you'll ever come across, and they're highly respected in that area. He's also very successful in terms of financial performance. He's doubled the sales of his company during his tenure, and his stock over the last couple of years has doubled. And they've done that with this focus on sustainability. He's helped Ecolab become an eco leader. And it's both in economics, but also in ecology. So with that, I'd like to invite Doug Baker up. He's the chairman and CEO of Ecolab to give us his thoughts today on what we can do to help make our companies even better. Doug?
Well, that was a great intro. I have 2 kids in college and a daughter who will be a senior next year looking at colleges. I don't talk about the English degree very often when I'm talking to the kids. So what do you do with an English degree? Well, you hope it's a foundation because it's certainly not going to be a platform long term. But it's worked out okay. I wanted to share some thoughts, and probably the best way to phrase it would be a report from the front lines in terms of water. And so this is going to be principally about water. You could talk about in terms of carbon footprint or other issues. They're related, and maybe some of the same things apply. Water's more complicated in many ways because we talk about the averages around the world and the challenges, but the challenges are even more acute than the averages would apply in many parts of the market, particularly emerging markets. And in some markets, frankly, there's no water challenge at all. I happen to be headquartered in Minnesota. We are not going to run short of water anytime soon, and based on the rainfall, we may be shipping it out of the state fairly shortly. I guess we are via the Mississippi River. So I want to offer our perspective on water, and it really comes from our breadth of service across a number of industries and the fact that we also serve customers in 170 plus countries. And whenever I say that, people then say, how many countries are there? And of course, it depends on how you count them, but we count 171 that we serve customers in. So our company, our commitment to customers and society is we will help enable clean water, safe food, abundant energy, and healthy environments. So we're the leaders in industrial water technologies. We had a capability. We bought Nalco a couple of years ago. We're a leader in food safety technologies for the food and beverage and food service markets, and environmental hygiene, particularly in acute care. So we do a number of things across a number of industries, all end up having a pretty large water footprint. And we serve many of your companies. We serve the largest companies in almost any industry we touch on, particularly in water-intensive industries. So industries there that we serve would be power, mining, now oil and gas, which with the advent of fracking, or really what I would say is the broadening of fracking activity, has turned it into a large water consumer. But metals, paper, food and beverage, a whole host of industries that use and have a large water footprint. So we've got, we believe, best-in-class technology. The backbone is science. We have, 1,700 scientists. A third of them are PhDs around the world working on understanding how do you have best-in-class antimicrobials, water conditioning, process know-how that we apply through a model of leveraging it with feet on the street. So we often make promises at headquarters, but you have to be able to deliver against those promises. And where the work gets done is in plants or restaurants or hospitals or hotels or whatever facility that has to operate. And so we have 45,000 people, 25,000 of which are sales and service folks who are actually in the units every month, every week, every day in some cases, of course, depending on the size. So we serve over 1 million customer facilities in 170 countries, and when you add up the number of service visits, we've got 15 million looks a year of what's happening. And this is across a wide spectrum of industries. So we do have, as a result of this, a unique perspective. Now, of course, we use this to be a foundation input for R&D, because what we like to do is create things that are needed. It's a lot easier. There are some companies that create things and find need. That's not us. We really want to be focused on what the needs are and help do that. So as a result, we see a lot. Now, this group I know is well-grounded in the water challenges and the facts and statistics around it. There's plenty of water in the world. Unfortunately, there's just not plenty of fresh water. And whenever you walk through those statistics, 2.5% of the water supply is fresh. Most of it's captured in ice and in the poles. And when you get down to groundwater and the other available water, it's a surprisingly small amount of the total water footprint. And then you get into groups like the World Economic Forum identifying this for, I think, 3 years running as one of the largest global risks, ranking it ahead of terrorism, food shortages, climate change. And they've done this on a continued basis. I take part in the Consumer Products Forum there, where we have a lot of the food and agri companies. This is an acute issue in their minds. It was really the fact that this is so important to that industry that led us to make the Nalco acquisition. Because ultimately, we knew you weren't going to have food safety without quality water. You weren't going to have food without quality water. All these things start intersecting. We also know that there's a supply imbalance, so the World Bank predicts a 50% shortfall between supply and demand by 2025. And we also know that this imbalance is imbalanced because it's particularly acute in some areas, and the 50% probably understates the challenges, particularly in emerging markets, where China's got 25% of the fresh water per capita that we have, but has got the majority of industrial expansion, and the two big areas for water are agri and industry. And so the population growth, the change in diet, all these things serve to drive this forward. And water is a part of everything that we touch. I don't care if it's power, electricity, these light bulbs, everything we have, the food on your plate. And as a company, you've got to decide where your water pressure is. Is it in front of you or behind you? So is it your input? If you're an agri company, a bottling company, it's behind you. Brewers, it's like 100 liters of water to make a liter of beer, mainly because of agri inputs. Dairy, if you're going to move from beer to dairy, it'd be a move. It would be like 10x, because cows and the agri inputs that are required to create milk. And so this goes on, but I think we're all familiar, and then we know that scarcity is projected to get even tighter as population grows, as the emerging markets have rising middle class. When we see this diet shift, they move from grains to protein, so that while we're going to have like a 50% increase in population, it's going to take 70 to 100% more calories to feed this population, given the shift in diet. And so all this is going to increase pressure, given that agri inputs are the number one use and probably the number one waste point for fresh water. So the increased irrigation to feed more people, et cetera. So this is the theoretical context. And often, I was telling somebody else, I've been in this hotel now 3 weeks in a row, in this room. Now, the prior 2 weeks were analyst meetings, where you got a bank, they invite you in here, you do a presentation on your company and business, and then you're in a series of one-on-ones around the business outlook and everything else. Well, that's always an interesting exercise. One, you always leave there and go, why aren't we growing faster? But that's another story. The other part is you get a lot of conversation about the narrative of water and when is it going to translate into real activity in the world, because water has been an active subject, certainly in the investment community and broader than that for the last 20 years. But what I would say is right now we are seeing a lot of real impacts on the ground with our customers. I would say they're particularly acute in the emerging markets. Not solely there. So it can be Cargill just shut a plant down in Texas because of drought conditions around beef. It was a slaughterhouse. Happened to be a customer. I was talking to the guy from Cargill this weekend when I ran into him. You know, what was it? How long is this input? Is this really a temporary thing? It's drought, but it's more than that because of cost of grain and everything else. So we have it locally, and I've lived through particular issues in this country, and there's obviously a huge imbalance in the southwest part of this world. But I was also in a meeting in a U.S. city at a very large food producer very recently, where the whole conversation was around a plant that they had in India. So they've got demand in India, and they've got capacity in this plant, but they can't fulfill the plant's capacity because they don't have and can't get enough water, because they got a very water-intensive process currently at that plant. So they have unmet demand. They've got huge pressure from investors, and they're stuck. So this is like today. So it's not as simple as deploying capital. They're going to have to go through, and they know it, and we're going to go work. How do we de-water that process? Because you aren't going to get enough water to fulfill the capacity given that plant's makeup and process design. Now, since they've got the supply or the demand, this is not a tough economic calculation for them to make, and they can deploy some capital in a sensible way to go, if you will, reduce this bottleneck. But it's really based on the economic benefits of the increased sales that is justifying the capital. Not that they have any economic value on water per se, and they haven't changed that. They don't need to here. But this is an equation that we see over and over. We have steel mills, we have power plants, we have other customers in China who are coming under acute scrutiny now, frankly, from public pressure because of the water challenges you have in China. China's got a huge food safety problem. You know what the root of it is? It's a very fragmented food supply. You got poisonings on one hand. It's not really a food safety challenge. That's man versus man, not man versus nature. On the other side, you've got most of the groundwater contaminated, and it frankly is poisoning the food early. It's a water-related issue. So what little fresh water they've had has been shrunk now simply because they aren't taking care of the effluents and the other outtake, and they aren't working it on a local level or on a broad national level. So we see this over and over again, and I imagine you have many more examples. I have 5 pages of them, but I got a clock down here that's telling me not to go through them all. So what do we see happening as a result of, if you will, the narrative and now I would say real life action on the ground where water is getting in the way of economic activity? You see things that companies are doing that I would say are working well, and so I'll highlight a few of these. I would also say that you continue to see a big miss broadly around, I think, what's going to need to happen if we're going to have the kind of change that is going to be required if we're going to avoid a reckoning one way or another. So what are customers doing? Well, clearly they're setting water goals. I've got a lot of examples of people in this room, and many of them are aggressive, some not so aggressive when you really take it apart, because typically, and we are as guilty as anybody, frankly, I looked at my water goals again coming in here, and I go, my God, they're terrible. They're not nearly aggressive enough when we look at it. And they're always per unit production, right? Because you can see a larger percentage as a result. Well, water is an absolute issue, right? It's not like God's going to give us more water if we become more productive. And, here's your reward. You guys are making 20% more stuff. Here's 20% more fresh water as a result. Unfortunately, it's not going to work that way. And so it's got to have to get down to absolute measures. But all of us have, I think, this percent or per output, and we all plan on more output. And we all secretly plan on as much output growth as we have water reduction. So we really don't have any plans to reduce water on a material scale at all. I would just say, and I will stand here as the first guilty. I have a few other brethren in here who would be guilty of this too, but I don't need to go through that. So I think that's one of our challenges, but there are some real goals. And then people are deploying technology and innovation. And I would say if you are going to go after this, then you do it in a very robust way. So we see people taking a holistic view, taking apart their process, much like you would if you wanted to take energy out of your process. They understand where the water comes in, how much goes out, where it all flows, how much is in trickle waste, how much is in process, how much is wasted in cleaning. Cleaning is one of the biggest areas of use, particularly in the food and beverage. And this is a process that can be built, and honestly, I think companies do this all the time quite well in a number of areas. The issue is, what's the genesis that's going to drive us to do this and start looking at water differently than, say, we look at, or more like we look at energy historically, or other inputs that have real cost and the threat of inflation. So we have some outliers who are doing this quite well. They have ambitious goals, and they're doing things. There are technologies that make a big difference. So we've deployed. We're in 4 seasons. We do all the 4 seasons around the world. We came out with a laundry program that reduces water and energy by 40 and 50%, not 5 and 10%. And it was frankly trying to design a process that was not water hungry. I mean, it was the objective of the design process, not simply economics, not simply clean, white, and soft, which is what we all want in our towels, whether we acknowledge it or not, but also how do you design this so it rips water out, reduce the cycle, reduce the rinse, reduce the waste. And there's a lot of examples of this throughout industry, in the bottling industry. How do you take cleaning processes and make it 3 cycles instead of 5? How do you do it at a much lower heat rate, temperature rate than you've done before? How do you alter the chemistry to enable those processes? And we get 40 to 50% types reductions. We've got an 80% reduction on lubricants for lines. It goes on and on. And we have a lot of people willing to pay now to do this, but at the end of the day, we've got to have an economic argument and use today's cost of water, which will be a theme I come back to because I think it's a problem. And it's going to be a problem, and it's not going to be solved for any of us externally. Outside energy, there's great technology that's impressed us. Right, Nike is starting to dye textiles without water. They've just taken it out of the process. You've got Netafim, a pioneer in drip irrigation, making it lower capital and getting after it. And irrigation is a huge issue. It's an issue that we don't touch, that's going to have to be resolved. India's biggest challenge, frankly, is water used in agri. It's free electricity. to the farmers. They pump up water as a result. I mean, you do exactly what we would all do. You're not going to manage your electricity or care about how much water you pump up. It's free. And it gets treated as such. So all these things are going to have to ultimately change. And then you see people measuring progress. So internally doing the stuff they do if they're serious about it. And you have now companies, which I'll get to, starting to price water different than the actual, trying to value water different than the price they pay. If there's a theme, I'm going to talk about it because it's something that we can do now, and I think it's going to be a very important issue. When they do it, they become much more serious about measuring it. And it's not a one-price-fits-all scenario. External, CDP, right, used to just say transparency. Now they're measuring actual progress. It used to be on carbon. Now it's on water, too. There is a lot of, I think, increased and heightened pressure, which ultimately we know starts beginning new activity and new priorities. So what's missing? I guess it's two things to do it in short, because I don't have a long time. First is a big bang catalyst. And what is a catalyst going to be that's going to drive us to change? And the second is this local understanding that water, on average, is how we like to think about things in big companies. And it's very dangerous to think about water on average. You need to understand your specific situation, your plant situation, your product supply stream situation as it pertains to water. So the big bang catalyst, pricing or regulation, what's going to happen? I don't personally believe this is going to happen quick enough or in a meaningful enough way to have a big enough impact to avoid a major problem. It's just too complicated. And so when you sit into, I don't care if it's a Davos where everything gets talked about, not much gets done. But even there, the conversations, when you start talking about it, is water a right or a privilege? You're going to go on and on. This is a very hard thing for governments. And then watersheds are typically never shared by one government. So you're going to have 4 governments self-assemble, right, coincidentally to come up with regulations which match, which is somehow going to save a watershed. Then, the odds, I'm an English major, but I have been around some math, and that's a tough equation to bet on. I just don't see it. I don't see it in pricing, and I don't see it in regulation, given how this has to happen. And frankly, the pressure is most acute where water is most dear in the challenges, the pressure politically. So then we see, if you've got to decide, here's what we're thinking and how we try to help our partners. You got to decide, is water a risk for you or not? It's not a risk for every company. We all like to talk about, but is it a real risk for your enterprise or not? We have companies here who list it on their proxy when they have to tell investors what their biggest corporate risks are globally. Water shows up on some companies here. So I guess they've decided that it's a huge issue. And it wouldn't be surprising who those companies were, right? It's the main ingredient in their product. And so it is a big risk, is the availability, quality, et cetera. If it's a risk for your company, then I think this idea of phantom pricing is important to think about internally. So I run an enterprise. What do our big companies do quite well? We are value creators, and I would say it's driven by financial discipline. And this financial discipline sometimes gets in the way of value creation long term, and you always try to harness it. So what do we all do and line up measurements on? Typically financial stuff. It gets in the way of talent, gets in the way of training, it gets in the way sometimes of water, or anything that's really underpriced versus its value, is what I would say. And I think new talent is always underpriced versus its value, and we don't quite understand the impact of training long term. So then we have to create new processes to get around, because the economic machinery of a company screws you up. And I think in water, it is the number one thing in the way. Because when we have conversations and we get challenged, and then we get into the purchasing gridlock, I can promise you, they value water at virtually every one of your companies at nada. 0. So there will be a corporate goal. We want to be water neutral. We want 30% less water, 40%. Then you get into the gridlock of deploying technology or capabilities, and it is not a measurement that is adhered to. And you know what? It's not in my company either. And so if this is going to change, I will just say, and I think it's going to have to change, we have some companies now leading the way, and there's all kinds of new words around how we do this. At the end of the day, you can get tripped up on all the concepts. If we don't change the input value of water in our financial equations, by the time the water costs that much, it's going to be too late. So water really needs to be priced, and we can do this internally. We don't have to wait for India to raise the value or the cost of water or China or anybody else. And I would bet every one of your companies does this, by the way, when you look at acquisitions in different markets. Because the standard practice is you raise the cost of capital to understand the risk. When you're buying a company, this is not, we do this. This is not new. I bet you every one of your companies does this. It's pretty standard. So cost of capital is, you could say 3-4 points. If we go buy it in an emerging market, we may use 12-13%. Now we do it because we're trying to understand the risk. So this is done in companies as a process. We just haven't applied it to water. Now, food companies are looking at this very aggressively because it's such an important input. And you figure out your own catalyst. I think there's going to have to be a catalyst within companies to drive change. And I don't think right now we've got it, and I don't believe the goals are aggressive enough to head off the 2025, if you believe in that math, that challenge. So one, we need a catalyst. I think it's probably going to have to come on the pricing side because I don't regulation is going to come soon enough. The other is, and then I'll move to Q&A, is water is inherently local. And we fight this all the time because it's easy and you want to look at the averages. And what we know is it really gets down to watershed. So we've got a large new facility in a watershed north of Shanghai. And we are now working there in partnership with other folks at how do you look at this watershed and how do you understand it? Who else is part of this watershed? And how do we all mutually understand what we need to do to protect it and keep it alive? None of us individually can have the impact we need to protect it long term. And so we identified this as a risk, partly because we're held to regulations in China that not everybody else is. We built the plant, and frankly, we had the most stringent water regulations and effluent regulations we've had to meet anywhere in the world. Now, we know not everybody else is meeting those, but we're meeting them, and it drove us to have to do things differently. And I think this is important, is understanding where your risk is by plant and by facility because of the vast differences in water challenges around the world. And if you don't do it, I think you can't manage your risk very effectively. It just won't work. And so this is stuff we've watched and learned, and you see some people deploying averages across the supply chain. Well, 40% is not going to work where you got an 80% supply shortage. So you really have to understand where you got the acute and where you got to deploy a mass of capital, like 12 ideas and 0 in your plant in Minnesota, if you're up there. So the advice is, companies are value, what's the catalyst? If I want to drive change in my company, I try to figure out what the catalyst for change is, what's going to drive it. I need 45,000 people singing the same song. What's going to start that song, and how do we drive that? I think that's one of the things, as I'm thinking about in our company, how do we do it? I think this is an industry-wide thing. Companies are lousy at determining future risks. So I think you're going to have to stand on some people's tables and shout at leadership, which we want people to do. Of course, I don't like it when they're doing it, but I appreciate it. Maybe a couple weeks later, you always say this, and they come in and go, I really don't like this. So, but you have to have it in a company, and somehow you've got to get it going and understand the true economic value of water to your business. What's it going to be worth when it's gone in a given watershed? How much capital has been deployed there? Are you thinking about it? And I think the CFO is a great partner in this, if you can get the CFO to understand that this is a real risk, not just chatter from 20 years ago. Because they will change the models, and they will drive some change. And so I think partnering with these guys is the right thing. So finally, we see this issue growing in importance and moving from theory to reality on a daily basis. Conversations we have customers now is solving actual problems where water's an issue. Da Vinci early said water is a driving force of all things in nature. I think our question right now is, are we going to change our water behavior fast enough to avoid our water behavior forcing us to change, if you get the point? It is one way or another, in 20 years, we're going to be doing very different things around water, and we're either going to do it proactively or reactively, and the cost of reaction in this area is going to be huge, because it's going to mean moving big capital blocks if you're out of water in given markets, because you can't process stuff if that's the case. So that's a conversation. So with that, I guess we open up to Q&A. Thanks.
Okay, that was really a terrific viewpoint from a true leader in this field. We have time for a few questions, and I know there are probably a lot of burning questions out there. This part of the discussion's not for attribution, so I wanted to mention that. But who has a question? I see a question over there. And let's use the mics, please.
Thanks, Neil. Robert Bernard, Microsoft. You mentioned something in passing. I just want to make sure I got it right. So that you're not looking at water or active in water and agriculture, and you probably know the stats, but I thought it was about 70% of worldwide water use is for agriculture and probably 30 to 50% it's wasted. So I'm curious why you're not there, or are you going there?
Yeah. You know, the reason is we just fundamentally, that's not the technology we have. But you're right. I mean, it really, and that number moves all around. But water is, you know, we use 70%. In Europe, it's about 40%. China, it's about half the water. US, it's a little more. India, it's much higher. And so that even moves around quite a bit. You'll use these global averages because you got some real overusers in agri. You know, this gets down to drip irrigation, GMO crops, and the like are big solves there, which become contentious issues in society too. And so I think we just have to understand total impact of these issues. But for us, it's just a case of focus. So industry is the second largest area of use. We're focusing on industry, and that's really the place. Where have the government's focus heretofore? Low-flow showers and low-flow toilets. It's like, 6% of water use is at home. But, we can't quite get over that, and we don't focus on farms broadly on regulation. And industry is now, I think, going to have to self-regulate just based on supply and demand.
Very good. Jeff?
Yeah, Jeff Seabright with Coca-Cola. Thank you, Doug, for a great presentation and for your partnership. I guess a comment and then a question. Just the comment is, all the water stresses that you've outlined and the pressures of 1 billion middle-class consumers coming online, et cetera, are only going to be exacerbated by climate change as well. So the medium through which climate is manifest is sort of the water cycle, and I think we're seeing more and more evidence that's taking hold, the World Bank report from last week being the most recent example. But so it just sort of strengthens the case for urgent action on water. The question is really about this notion of shadow pricing and putting a shadow price on water. Given the fact that it's so local, you can't set a global shadow price as you could for carbon, because in places of abundance, it's not going to work.
Carbon's a world market.
World market. Water is very local, and if it's scarce, it should be more expensive. If it's vastly abundant, then less expensive. So how would you set that shadow price?
Well, I think that's the point, and I think pricing here is going to have to be locally done for you. I mean, we all have X facilities. We have 100 manufacturing facilities. We may have to have a different water input price for every one of those facilities. And so I think you have to understand the value of water at that facility. In some places, I mean, it could be exactly what you're paying for it. I don't think it's wrong in every case, but some places it's way off in understanding that. So I think that's what has to happen. And that's why I don't think we can wait for the market, because we're in 100, I think we have manufacturing facilities in 50 countries. We're going to wait for 50 countries to get over and price water correctly. It's just not going to happen. And so I think this is the fantasy that everybody's been waiting for. Carbon, you could. I mean, I think you can manage and change more quickly across the country. And people are experimenting there, because I think they can get their minds wrapped around it.
Yeah, Jim Davis with KPMG. Great presentation, and Jeff actually stole my question on shadow pricing for water, so I'll ask a different one. You touched on the relationship between water and energy just briefly in your comments about India, and everything's too cheap to meter, so there's no conservation happening. Can you say a little bit more about this, the connection between the two? Because I think, energy is, 30% of water goes to energy consumption or energy production when you look at the full supply chain and energy. And on vice versa, about 30% of energy use in a state like California goes to water, moving water around, heating water, the applications of water as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's energy, food. Food takes a lot of energy to produce. There's a lot of people talking about the nexus. I would say we're in the middle of it. We do a lot of the water technology work for the oil companies. In oil, it's principally produced water. You're pulling out really nasty water 2 miles, from 2 miles below the earth, and what do you do with that? Truth is, it could probably become net water producers, but you're going to have to, instead of flaring off gas, probably use it for desal operations. But then again, energy's rarely where people are, which is probably a good thing in terms of, where do you find oil and the like. So I think this is why this equation, we work hard to measure things on what we call total impact, on what the trade-offs are, and try to understand all the inputs and what choices do you want to make, and make them consciously. We make sometimes the wrong choices. We try to help customers understand this, because you're not going to get, so desal is a very energy-intensive process. And they're coming up, I think they will solve desal. I don't think humans are going to perish because of lack of water. We will figure it out. But it's going to come at a pretty dear cost if we're not careful. And I don't think we do this trade-off conversation very effectively at all. So you have local farming, which I love to pick on, part because I live in Minnesota, and if we just do local farming, we eat beets 6 months a year. So I sit around the dinner table with friends, and they're on, local farming, you don't know CO2 to get it from table to everything else. I said, well, yeah, but you got 9 billion people soon. You're going to have to feed them. The most efficient way of shipping water is in an agricultural product, right? If it takes 8 gallons to grow a cucumber, it's cheaper to ship the cucumber than 8 gallons of water right around the earth. Food's going to ship further, I think, not shorter in aggregate, not for rich people that you find in the U.S. who get a choice of spending too much on food, but broadly, you're not going to feed 9 billion people. And so that trade-off of that CO2 that they're talking about, so California, we grow a lot of our food there, get a lot of sunshine. You don't have that much water, and so it's pumping out of aquifers, and I'm not sure we're understanding or doing that total cost analysis and measuring both energy, CO2, and water, and understanding there are trade-offs between the two. I think we're going to get forced into it.
And that's exactly the point. And even when you bring it down to the local scale, even looking at a facility level, there's a trade-off between energy and water. And actually combined, there's a synergy. And I think we need to be careful when we talk about these issues to really look at these synergistic, the transaction costs, as you were talking about.
I would agree. And so you need a pretty sophisticated tool and discussion. And you need sophisticated goals and real measurement on them. Right now, energy trumps because it costs more.
Yep.
Okay, one final question.
Thanks, Doug. My name is Yalmaz Siddiqui from Office Depot, and we've come across an innovator recently in our travels who is articulating that the water issue is actually misunderstood because most of the world's water is in the air, in the humidity that we all experience, especially in relatively hot climates. And he says that if we can find an effective way to tap that humidity, really by using condensation, that the issue is moot. So do you have a take on that kind of out there idea?
Well, I don't, but here's what I guess I would say. I don't think long-term energy is a problem for humanity or water. We are not short on water. There's the cycle of water in Earth, even fresh, is pretty amazing. And you look at, it's only 2.5% of the water is fresh right now, and of that, we're using like 0.3% of the total water supply is accessible to humans. It's peanuts. So I don't have any doubt we're going to solve either through desal and or, condensation and other things ultimately. And the sun is sending down 20,000 times more energy than we use right now every day, right? We don't know how to harness it and do that. I just think the problem is you're not going to solve that before 2025 or whatever date you want to get. That you have an intersection point and you got a problem that is coming at us faster than solutions. And I think we got to reckon with that. So, if it's, I know this can be solved ultimately, I don't care. And if you're not in a business that's dependent on water, I don't know what business that is, by the way. If you're in one of those businesses, maybe you can avoid thinking about this. But I think to think that we're going to solve it some magical way. 2025, it's 12 years. I mean, it's nothing if you think back what you're doing 12 years ago. So that's, I think, the big problem. But I'm a believer, we'll invent this. Remember scarcity of oil, peak oil, and all this other conversation? I mean, once you're in the energy business, when they pull up stakes on an oil well, everybody knew this, 65 to 70% of the oil was left in the ground because they didn't have the technology to get it. So to believe in peak oil at that time with the math they were using, you had to believe humans were not going to introduce any new technology to go get the other 70% of the oil, which would be, a big assumption. And so I think it will be solved, but not in time for all of us and not to affect our careers. This group, I think we're going to have a big water imbalance and a big water shortage we're going to have to deal with. And it's how fast can we get people to reckon with it, and are we going to do it proactively or reactively? So I think that's it. It's a time challenge.
All right.
All right.
Another big hand for Doug.
Thank you.
This is really good.